We are live, Divya.
Great. Thank you so much. All right. So once again, for everyone on YouTube, good evening. Thank you for joining us as a part of the BITSAA Sahaaya initiative. I welcome you to today's session. I'll briefly introduce Dr. Banerjee, who is our speaker for today and has made time to talk to us and share his insights on how we can handle grief and loss during these troubled times. So Dr. Banerjee has completed his post-graduation in psychiatry from NIMHANS, Bangalore. Subsequently, he has worked as a senior resident in general psychiatry for 2 years before he also completed his postdoctoral, which is DM, in geriatric psychiatry, which is for old age, from the same institute. He has been attached with the geriatric unit of NIMHANS for over 3 years now and specializes in aging and old age related mental health problems, especially like dementia. He has several awards and distinctions to his credit, including being a gold medalist in MBBS. He has been the recipient of the Gandhi Fellowship Award. He was the best student in psychotherapy during his MD and also won the ICMR Young Scientist Award. And he has presented in several national and international conferences. So Dr. Debanjan is a reviewer of the esteemed Indian Journal of Psychiatry and several other journals in the mental health space. And he's actively involved in the training of postgraduate student counseling as well as research. He's also been published extensively in national and international columns, including Google, Telegraph, and many others. So we're really grateful for your time, Dr. Banerjee, and looking forward to have this conversation. To just kind of provide an overview of what the session will look like, we'll start with your presentation, followed by a Q&A discussion for 30 minutes, where we also invite people to share their lived experiences in the past few months because of the pandemic. So thank you so much, and the stage is yours.
Yeah, Divya, I am audible, right? Am I audible?
Yeah, Dr. Banerjee, you are audible.
Yes, we can hear you.
Right. So thanks Divya, and thanks to BITSAA International for having me here. This was primarily at the request of Secretary there.
Yes.
Hi, Debanjan. Hi, Debanjan. I'm there. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah. No problem. So I think I should congratulate you guys for just having this as a topic today, because I'm sure that there hasn't been a single person over the last 1.5 years who haven't faced any form of grief or loss, especially during these trying times. And what I'm going to do probably just give my perspective as to what we have seen over the last more than a year, especially during the second wave where loss was so rampant. And we'll not just talk about loss of life, but probably many other dimensions of loss which we commonly miss, because grief, according to many, it's not unidimensional. It can involve loss of a lot of things. And then it would be fantastic to have your perspectives as well as to how you guys have faced it, and we can all learn from each other. There is no one way to resolve grief. So Divya, I'll start sharing my screen if that's fine.
Yes, please.
Just feel free to stop me anytime if anything's not visible or I'm not audible.
Yeah.
Fine, right?
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Yes.
Right. So over the next, some around 30 minutes, I'll just be discussing certain aspects of how grief affects us. And we all understand the English connotation of grief, but then how it really matters, how do we deal with it, especially during these trying times? And specifically, what are the things that we should watch out for when we talk about mental health? And we all know that grief can lead to different dimensions where your physical and mental health can get affected. I specifically thought of putting this as the title because one thing that I personally feel very intriguing is that all our faces are covered with masks, and provided we wear the mask in the right way, it's only the eyes visible. So a lot of human emotions, we normally call the face as the mirror of human emotions, and most of it is covered, especially for the frontline workers like us, like many others, including people who come to deliver us food, nurses, police, people with law enforcement authorities. For them, many times the grief is masked and they are not able to really express it the way they want it to or share it with others. And that's when it really leads to probably, quite catastrophic consequences. So I just wanted to start with this very, very famous quote for all of you who are Lord of the Rings fans. You'll remember this, that I'll not say do not weep, for not all tears are an evil. And if you really think carefully, uh, feeling sad or weeping for a loss is often considered to be a weakness. And including many of us, even who are in the profession. And that probably leads to a perception that you cannot express grief the way it's supposed to be. Because if you do that, then you are probably in need of help, and that's not good, quote unquote. But what we really tend to forget is that the only way that we can share, whatever we feel inside us, are through sharing our emotions with the persons near to us. And the more we distance ourselves from them, the more probably it leads to, seclusion. We become isolated. Thanks to the pandemic, we are already isolated. We talk about digital connection, virtual connections. We are in fact using virtual medium to connect with all of you today. But how many of us can really do it when we need it? So this has been pretty much scenario over the last more than 1.5 years. And I always start my presentations with this slide because we definitely don't know that when this bus is going to come to a stop, at least in different parts of the world is different. Before I thought I go into grief proper, I really want to take this opportunity to discuss a little bit about what we think of mental health. For many of us, or irrespective of the social class, education, background, country, a lot of people who come to us, for them, being mentally healthy is not having the absence of a mental problem. And the very basic concept of this mental issue or mental health concern is so vague that we don't know that when it really strikes us. I'll give you an example. Let's say somebody has diabetes, which we all are familiar with. We know that the international cutoff is 200. So if your blood sugars cross 200, I'll diagnose you as having diabetes. And for a normal person, it should be below 120. So what if someone has 175, 190, let's say 199? Theoretically, you cannot diagnose him or her as diabetes. But what we normally use in scientific terms is IGT, impaired glucose tolerance, or in very simple words, a pre-diabetic stage. So when we diagnose someone with depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, dementia, whatever it is, we are diagnosing them with a kind of mental disorder, a disease which is similar to, let's say, COVID, typhoid, malaria, diabetes, hypertension, anything. But for someone who has not reached that 200 cutoff and is somewhere before, but is also not quite okay, it's extremely distressed. For that person, even if he or she is not, they're going to office regularly, meeting their families, talking to them, but somewhere probably they're extremely stressed. They're having financial issues. They're not able to talk to people. They avoid the crowd. They don't want to go out unless it's really necessary. So this period is that 120 to 200 period when you are at a pre-diabetic stage, but you really cannot be diagnosed with a problem. Now, why do I say this here? Because grief can lead you to that concern stage where if you do not resolve it properly, or if you do not have the necessary support, if you do not take professional help if it is necessary, if and when it's necessary, it can take you beyond that threshold. That line can be broken, and you can actually develop frank mental health problems. So based on the World Health Organization definition, when we talk about mental health, it's also to have a normal ability to cope with your stresses of life. You cannot expect that life will be stress-free, and none of us expect that. But if we are able to deal with it the way probably, that's okay to us without damaging our personal, professional, occupational life in its capacity, then we can tell that we are actually doing mentally well. We'll come to this concept of stress because grief is, in fact, a kind of stress. Now, what can lead to stress in our day-to-day life? Just because today we are discussing in light of the COVID pandemic with the second wave just weaning off and all over the media, the risk of third wave impending. Stress can happen due to multiple things. There are role changes within the family due to the pandemic. There is work from home versus work for home. Education, the entire definition has changed. We need an entire different discussion for that altogether. There has been change in relationships. The families have been separated. A lot of families who have been together, not all of them are happy. There have been increase in abuse, in discord, in families falling out. And most importantly, this is something which all of us have faced. We have faced a sense of loss of control over circumstances. I mean, today when I go to hospital and I come back, I don't know if because of me, someone else will get infected. There is no way that I'll get to know that. If somebody goes out for some work, you come back, you have your senior parents, other seniors, your children. You don't know if you're the reason of causing the infection. And most importantly, you don't know what's lying ahead of you. Everywhere in the media, you have probably heard about uncertainty. And this uncertainty actually increases the intensity in which you feel grief, because you do not know exactly the context or circumstances in which you may face the loss. Now, stress is fine. It is adaptive. I mean, all of us here know that if before exam we do not have stress, before an interview we do not have stress, then God bless us. It's needed. Body adapts to it. But what we mean by distress is, to very simply put it, harmful stress. When it starts crossing that line, when it starts becoming, extremely difficult for you to basically lead on your day-to-day life, it can affect your mind, it can decrease your concentration, it can lead to feel extremely edgy or restless. Physical problems can be there, and there can be a lot of unpleasant sensation. Very importantly, distress, especially if someone is in their middle age or more so, let's say, as of 40, there can be a lot of physical problems, which commonly we do not give much importance to. Now, the funny thing is, we don't see the mind. So if somebody is, if your heart is beating fast, okay, there's a problem. If your stomach is paining, that, okay, there is an issue, you have to go to the doctor. If you are having acidity, you know it. Any of your body parts have a trouble, you see it, you know it. You don't see the mind. It's as abstract as it can be. So we normally don't focus on the mind unless really necessary or really it breaks the line. But mind, on the other hand, has immense connection with the body. I mean, a lot of people ask me that, what's the difference between brain and mind? That's something we have been struggling to basically fight over decades now. And there is no one answer to that. Now, while that is important to understand, it's also true that many times a person who has high BP might have higher BP. Sugars might get deranged. You might face a lot of sleep difficulties. You might feel extreme degree of anxiety, fidgetiness. You can't sit at one place. Uh, you can start having sexual problems between the couples. Now, all these can happen if there is an immense amount of distress following a loss or following a bereavement. Now, again, I'll come to this later that loss can be, there can be different dimensions of loss altogether. So it's not just about loss of life. The first loss that we have already discussed is the loss of a structure to a life, the loss of a lifestyle. And the entire gamut of loss starts with that. Now, just to have, I think by this time, media all around you have sufficiently frustrated you with this information. So I won't spend much time on this slide, but this will just give you a premise that there are so many dimensions in which we have been affected. In fact, I have written on this, and I always discuss this with my colleagues and with my audience when I have a talk, that we are discussing about mental health with such a great impetus today. It's unfortunate that we needed a pandemic to have an eye-opener for the importance of mental health, but something which was long, long overdue. And in some way, at least psychiatrists like me, will look towards this virus as a kind of opportunity to basically enlarge the crevices of mental health that were lying in front of us all these years. So if you see, I have put grief in the first box. Every single thing, including loneliness, uncertainty, being on the front line, loss of your freedom, stigma towards people who have got infected with COVID, every single factor can actually affect your grief when you face the loss. So starting with loss, which is the topic for today. How has, what all we have really lost, after I finish, my part of it, I'll actually ask you guys as to what do you think has been the most valuable thing that you have lost or you have sensed that you may have lost. Death is one aspect of it. Yes, there have been, lakhs, millions dying, getting affected. But more importantly, loss does not just start with the loss of life. Imagine in a family when 3 people are affected with COVID, one person is hospitalized in a critical state, the other person is hospitalized in a different ward with a moderate infection, and the person with mild infection is probably at home. So when you know that the life is going or it's difficult to save a person, the loss begins on a continuum there. It's called apprehensive grief, or it's called apprehensive loss. So having lost your fitness, having lost your ability to move or work the way you used to, because COVID leads to immense amount of fatigue, loss of routine, loss of certainty, loss of relationships. Your children are not able to meet their friends, go to school, play with everyone in the playground. There are no meets, no parties, no social touch. We can't have a hug. We can't have a friendly pat on our back. We can't just, hang out with our friends. We can't share a success. We cannot. A lot of us, physical activity have got restricted. Probably now things are opening up, but for a long time, social clubs, gyms, they were closed. We do not have celebrations. There are no gatherings. And the thing that probably none of us consider as grief, but which will go on to affect us for decades, a loss of future, of plans. Imagine a person who was ready to go for a job after completing his or her graduation, a child who was about to give his or her exam, a MBBS student who never knew that without even knowing the basics of medicines after passing the final year when practical training has not been started, you'll be inside a COVID ward seeing deaths and triage every single day with loss of lives. So that's what loss is. Loss is so multivaried and so multidimensional that if I talk to every single person present here, I'm sure a lot more will come than what's there on this slide. I'm sure all of us understand what grief, you know, but what is also important to know is that grief is not an all or none phenomenon. If I lose something today, let's say, uh, to give you a very recent example, there was a kind of uh, a multi-nation discussion on a particular topic schedule, a kind of let's say a very prestigious webinar. But then what happened is that it got not only postponed, it got cancelled. So for many, it might not really seem something to equate with grief, because for us, grief is usually a very heavy term. But of course, it's a loss. It's an understanding that something which you were expecting or looking forward to doesn't happen. It's a disappointment. So grief starts with disappointment, and then it leads to, it's not always about feeling sad, but it can lead to a lot of physical changes. You feel extremely fatigued. In fact, I was telling someone that day, somebody who has just come out of COVID, that the amount of fatigue that you are facing now, you can also face when your mind is not fine. And that is exactly how much relationship mind really has with the body. You can feel weak. There may be change in eating habits, sleep problems. And what is most important to understand is that grief is very common. And most of the times it is unresolved or unreported. But what is alarming, especially in the context of India, which has one of the highest suicide statistics globally, is that latent grief or not able to get adequate support after you have lost anything or anyone has almost 5 times increased risk of suicide. Now, that doesn't mean that every single person who is grieving will go on to harm themselves. But even if there is one life lost, it's a life lost because probably we couldn't intervene in time. You will all be familiar with this. Kubler-Ross has given a general understanding of grief, and these are not technical terms. This is not limited to psychiatrists or science. It's very kind of easy to understand. Let's just think, if we have lost someone, unfortunately, initially we deny, we don't want to accept the loss. Then there is a tremendous anger or a kind of pent up feeling that why did it have to happen with me? Why this? Why this person? Why is it that it had to happen at this particular time? Why couldn't it wait? Then we start kind of, bargaining with the situation. Somebody who is not having food or not having water, is neglecting himself or herself, start gradually thinking that whether that's fine or whether they should come back to the normal life. But the moment you start coming back to your usual self, you are struck with sadness, memories of the deceased person. You yearn or you crave to be with that person. You think about the person's memories, the belongings. You try kind of avoiding the place where probably the person was there. And then sometime, eventually in this process, you accept. Now, there are funny things to what we are taught. And of course, there are irony to that. So the first day I learned about this in times of my medical training, I thought, wow, this is so simple and this is so easy to accept grief. So why go through all this discussion at all? But then this is what happens. We are taught that this is theory, but if you ask every single person how the person has grieved, irrespective of any other classification or criteria, you will never get a linear answer. Trust me, you will never get. And that includes experience from myself. So these stages, of course, happen. Whether they happen in a sequence, no, they don't. Whether they have to happen in a person, again, no. How each person resolves his or her grief are extremely individualized, and it can be as different as the markings on your palm. So for, even if you go through all you might get a lot of self-help books, materials, brochures. There are plenty of grief coping materials on the internet, and many of them talk about the stages. But why I specifically wanted to mention this is, do not read these stages and compare that, okay, am I in a stage of bargaining? Am I in a stage of depression? Doesn't matter. If you just talk to yourself in front of the mirror every day and you feel that makes you comfortable, that's it. That's the route that you take. Doesn't matter what a person has hypothesized years ago. At the same time, it's also important to understand that when we talk about pandemic, how grief manifests has become very different. A lot of young people are dying, especially during the second wave. For many older adults, it becomes survivor's guilt. I have heard so many, I work in a geriatric setup, so I hear many of my patients telling that my son has died. Why my son? He had years to live. It could have been me instead of him. So that's survivor's guilt. You never know. Today a person is in ICU, next day the person is in CCU, next day the oxygen drops, saturation drops, next day the person goes into the ventilator. Life is uncertain. It's happening rampantly in the second wave. We have lost so many almost every day. And besides that, again, as I told you, the process of loss of health and loss of life. So you don't get beds, you don't get oxygen support, you don't, every few months back, almost every single hospital, there were no beds available, there are no ICU, there are no ventilators. So every time, when you are not able to get a help for an ailing person, your understanding a bit of life is going off. That itself is grief. And why is it important to understand this? Because later, when you think about the entire process of caring for a person, it helps. Commonly, the best analogy will be that when a person suffers from dementia. I'm sure many of you have watched the movie, Still Alice, and many of you know what dementia is. So it's a kind of progressive problem of the brain where a person loses memory, thinking, understanding, judgment. Unfortunately, doesn't have a cure or a reversal. Person can live for years altogether, but gradually ceases being the person he or she was. So what we talk about when ultimately the person is not there or is in the terminal stage of dementia is about this entire process when the family has looked after him or her and gone through every single nitty-gritties of the care. The same thing happens when loss of life happens, or let's say, for matter of fact, any loss happens. Sometimes it's sudden, sometimes you never expect. Nowadays it's happened that when a call comes from hospital, you're always alarmed. And the most important fact of grief is when you do not get the necessary social support. For many reasons, there are travel restrictions. Every one of us are not tech savvy. A large population of our country is not tech savvy. There are network issues. Imagine if somebody holds your hand and talks to you, the way you feel versus if you have a screen in front of you flashing light, how you feel. That's the best get, but that's not really a substitute of a human touch, isn't it? And very importantly, the mourning rituals, and there has been so much of discussion. One of the things that I decided when I thought of talking to you about this, I thought I will not tell you or I will not suggest an online mourning ritual. One day I told about this to one of my patients, and you know what he told me back? He told, "Sir, this is not a webinar. It's not really great to sit here miles apart, watch at my loved one's body being buried or going into the fire without even crying on the shoulders of my loved one. I better just don't see it at all." I really thought back, it's so easy for us to write, it's so easy for us to suggest that everything can be done digitally. But for years altogether, we humans have developed certain social habits, and one fine day a pandemic comes. Irrespective of how tech savvy you are, probably you really cannot get back to that so easily. That's one. Second, even if you do it online, if you do the morning rituals, and worldwide, a lot of places have done that, that leads to a kind of incompletion, with your grief. It's not, you do not feel listened to. You do not feel that the suffering or the yearning that is there inside you, that's being heard, because you're not able to do it in front of your loved ones. And time and again, research has shown that immediate support after the grief for the first 1 or 2 months is extremely critical to determine how your mental state is going to be in the coming months to years. Now, this is how a typical average person grieves. There are different kinds of self-blame. I could have done something. Why didn't I do this? Critically analyzing the scenarios before, feeling sad, feeling stuck. And this depression to stuck phase can go on for quite some time. Mind it, when I talk about depression here, I am not talking about the illness that is depression. I'll come to that later. By depression, I mean sadness of mood, not the disease depression. But yes, grief is one of the foremost risk factors for developing depression, which is an illness. And that is what we have to prevent. And probably that is why we are having the talk today. That just because you are having grief, it doesn't mean that you cannot be depressed. And if you are depressed, besides the usual support that you need to come out of the grieving stage, you also need professional help. And eventually, that stuck time varies, but then ultimately you go ahead to accept it at some time or the other. Now, coming to what I was discussing some time back. When we talk about depression, we talk about a mental health illness, a severe mental illness, which lasts for 2 weeks or more at least, where you have intense low mood. It can affect your appetite, your sleep patterns. You get up early in the morning and you do not feel like even facing the day. There is a lot of fatigue. You feel unworthy of life. You feel hopeless. You don't want to do anything. And you can even have thoughts of self-harm. Now, when I tell all these, you might think that a lot of them are common to grief as well. The most important difference is in grief, the sadness, the yearning, the thoughts, the hopelessness, everything is related to the dead person or the loss. However, if it is transiting into depression, then all of these will become generalized and there might be extreme fatigue. And when your body function starts getting affected, that is the line that I spoke about in the beginning about distress. And that's the time when you need to basically seek professional help. We psychiatrists, we are often very much criticized for so-called pathologizing normal human emotions. And I have had heated arguments with many of my friends in sociology or anthropology because they feel that we pathologize normal human emotions like grief. But what is imperative is that yes, grief is not, I repeat, it is not a mental health disorder, but it is a risk. If you fall down and if you hurt your head, and it can just be a simple hurt. Once, it doesn't matter. Twice, it doesn't matter. You might just get up and go ahead with your bike. But if it keeps happening repeatedly, the multiple concussions will start affecting your brain and the functioning of your brain. So grief is a risk factor for a severe mental illness, that is depression. And if you yourself feel that these symptoms are happening to you, especially weight loss, lack of appetite, extreme sadness, and feeling of self-harm, you should encourage the person or yourself to seek help immediately. There are certain red flags for this, which I'll come to later on. And grief, in turn, also leads to loneliness. A person just tries to seclude himself or herself, not feeling like talking to any person. Now, loneliness often can be due to both your own personality, due to the circumstances around you, the environmental factors, and especially during COVID times because of travel restrictions and social distancing. So imagine a person who is already grieving and that person is not able to reach out. Maybe he's secluded, maybe there are no neighbors around, maybe the person stays alone, even the domestic help is not coming, the person is not tech savvy, or most importantly, the person is in isolation or in quarantine, and the other family member who got affected with COVID has probably passed away. So how is the person really going to be in touch with others? Again, virtual connections are the only norm, but it's not really a substitute. And this is how loneliness can make you feel. Especially, it can be disastrous in later life, and it's an increased factor. It increases the risk of dementia and suicide in elderly as well. Loneliness can lead to a lot of feelings of anxiety, not being understood by others, feeling empty inside, feeling abandoned. And it's a vicious cycle. The more you feel that way, the more you will not be interacting with others, and eventually you will be cocooned more and more within yourself. So that's about how grief manifests and how there are different shades of grief during the pandemic. Comes the vital question: what can we do about it? I'll start with something that I personally follow. Let's take a step back and let us first accept the loss. What I started, I mentioned when I started this, that there is no one way to grieve. And many times, and this is probably the commonest emotion that we feel, be it after losing a job, after an exam is cancelled, after a lifestyle has got ruined, probably after the work, personal life schedule has got disrupted, we often feel that, let's try and bypass it. Let's try our best not to feel broken down. If you feel that you are going down, if you're feeling stressed, rather than fighting it back and trying to mask it like we normally wear masks, let us not emotionally mask ourselves. That's all that I want to mean by it. There is no right or wrong way. I have had patients who simply go and talk to a tree. They're from rural areas. And when I asked them that, how does it make you feel better? This gentleman told me that my wife has expired, and for generations I have known that, our forefathers have been living in this tree. Their spirits reside here after they die. So I'm sure that my wife is here and she's able to listen to me. And I just pour my heart out in front of her, and that makes me feel better. That makes him feel better. And that's the way. Doesn't matter which stage of grief he or she is going through. Doesn't matter if other strategies are working or not. So you can have your own strategy, and there is absolutely no the way for grieving. So if you are feeling stressed, if you're feeling that you are not able to really do something that you were doing before, take a break. And that's the first thing to do. We were discussing all the while about getting connected through virtual connections. Yes, it's necessary. Probably we can also help people who are not that tech savvy, but it's also important that the dimensions of connection are different. So for example, if you may feel that I'm crying, so I'll not do a video call, let's do an audio call instead. But if the person was in front of you and you were really crying in front of that person, could you really hide your emotion? You couldn't. So if you are feeling that you want to talk to the person in person, as much as possible, so use the modality or the digital modality which satisfies you best. Don't hide, and stay connected. Take whatever sources of social support that you have, especially when you are grieving. And there should be one person. If you are assisting a person who is grieving, make sure that even if the person is not willing to do that, at least through you, the other person who is grieving can stay connected, can have human connection. Before we go any further with understanding how to deal with the grieving process, the person who has undergone the loss will be extremely vulnerable during the time of pandemic, and we cannot neglect it. I have seen people who have lost their jobs, their loved ones, simply go out telling, doesn't matter to me anymore, I'll not use masks. And it can be disastrous. So if you really want to have a healthy mind, first you have to stay safe and stay physically healthy. And probably the most important thing that I would urge and request all of you to do is that whatever happens, three things: have some sort of physical activity. Doesn't matter, you do yoga, physical, work, you do, you have your own kind of asanas, or you practice something else, or you just jog, just continue doing that. Even if you do not feel nice, don't stop the physical activity, because it helps immensely in structuring our body and mind. Second, just ensure at least you have a proper diet. I know sleep will be definitely a problem if you have lost someone or something, but make sure that you do not deprive yourself of nutrition. And most importantly, don't pop in pills. If you have to take medicines, if it is sleeping medicine or sedative, anti-anxiety, you might go to the pharmacy and somebody might give you. Fortunately or unfortunately, the number of unqualified medical professionals in our country or self-proclaimed medical professionals are many, much more than actual medical professionals. So that's a risk. Do not take medical advice from people other than professionals. Doesn't matter which pathy. It can be modern medicine, allopathy, homeopathy, doesn't matter. But take the help from someone who is qualified in that particular stream. A lot of people have caused unnecessary complications and risks by consuming hydroxychloroquine on themselves during the first wave when it started. So please be mindful about this. Coming to grief per se, the common model that I at least discuss with people is the tier model. So T stands to accept, which we discussed already. E is to experience the pain of the loss, which is very important. I mean, a lot of us feel that let's just bypass it, let's just go around it, or let's do something to distract. And avoidance becomes a major factor. I'll not go into the room of the person. I will not look at his or her belongings, but that in turn just keeps it repressed. A stands to adjust to the new environment. Many of you might ask me, how do I forget? How do I forget what happened? No, you shouldn't. How will you forget? How can anyone forget a person who was there in their life and today is not existing? The key to grief is remembrance, not forgetting. You build a new identity and a new life based on the memories of the person who is not there anymore, not by forgetting the person. And then finally, you try and invest your physical and mental resources into the new reality. Now, again, as I said, this is a generic model. Different people, all of you might adapt it according to your needs. But these are certain basic things which might seem very generic, but trust me, very less people follow. This is the right time to fall back on whatever sources of social support you have. That's the first thing. Do what you feel is right. And of course, within your self-care and legal limits. But then, it doesn't matter how you're grieving. It matters how you experience the pain. Mind it that take care of your basic needs. If your sleep is getting disrupted, fine, but at least make sure that you are taking your basic self-care. You may feel extremely helpless, and the thought that comes is, why am I feeling like this? I should not, I should get back to work. I might have other responsibilities, especially people who are on the front line or who have to go out to work. It is a time to take a step back and take a break. Grief is like a fracture. If you do not give time to your mind, it will not heal. It has no difference with the fracture of a bone. The more you share the loss, actually it helps. It doesn't lessen probably for many, but it helps. It helps for you to understand the loss better. You can always cherish the memories and remember that you have to give time to yourself and you cannot bypass it. Someone, if comes and tells me that, doctor, I came out of grief in 2 days, just like that. I always have my own skepticism that probably is going to strike back later, and there is something which is unresolved. Sometimes it is unresolved, in fact, it's not necessary that you have to completely get over that feeling and ultimately start your normal daily life, but it's the other way around. It's like normal, whatever you were doing, your work, your hobbies, through that, you get back, you reintegrate yourself into the normal identity. This is a fantastic slide from, one of the psychology portals. And if you see that there is no one way, Some people feel happy writing down. There are thought diaries. There are groups like you have Alcohol Anonymous groups. There are groups even online, especially in times of COVID, who support and share their loss. And if you feel that you need to talk to someone without being judged, there is no harm in seeking help. There are helplines. I mean, NIMHANS is running a psychosocial helpline. If any of you want, I can share the number with you. It's anyway there on the NIMHANS website. Various central agents, institutes like AIMS, CMC Velo, they're running helplines. There are a lot of private helplines, whichever makes you feel comfortable. It might be a time to distract yourself nurturing one of your old hobbies. Initially, you might not feel nice, but again, the more you engage in your daily routine, probably something which you thought of starting before and now you start, the quality might be worst, doesn't matter. But through the process of doing that, probably at one point of time, you'll be able to cope with grief. And remember, these are only very, very few of the methods. Who knows, you might invent your own. This is a general schema of events from the American Psychological Association, just to give you an understanding that every single person experiences grief differently and there is no generic model. But again, the three more important things are: you take a break, focus on things that you can control in your life. And coming to the most sensitive part of it, I always tell that besides social distancing, practice digital distancing. So try and have some COVID-free time. I am absolutely sure that all of you are aware, over the last 1.5 years, every single person has become COVID expert. Morning to night, there are plethora of information, statistics, conspiracy theories about COVID, and especially when you lose someone or something to COVID, these can become intolerable at a point. So the best strategy will be that keep half an hour or 1 hour or whatever designated time to keep yourself updated. Use some authentic sources like the World Health Organization website, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention CDC website, our very own Indian Council of Medical Research, the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, which are duly updated. And that's it. After that half an hour or that period of time, please don't go into specifics of the COVID information, especially not at night, because it has immense harmful effects on sleep. Few very important considerations. There may be intense feelings of sadness. Just cry your heart out if needed. There is no harm, no shame in that. Indulge yourself. Do whatever makes you feel happy. If you feel helpless, if you do not feel like going to work, if you do not feel like talking to people for a brief period of time, if you have one close confidant, that is enough. But yes, be mindful. Do not give in to impulsive decisions or addictions, which somebody might give into alcohol or smoking to cope up with this. That's harmful. Lifestyle will obviously be disrupted. Whatever it is, do not compromise your basic self-care. And even if you feel like retiring to a cocoon, at least allow one close person in. It helps. As I already mentioned, keep away from the media. Grief or not grief, it's always helpful. And I think one thing that COVID has taught us, that even though digital communication is extremely helpful, there should be a controlled digital communication. Too much of information is not good for anything. And especially those who are in isolation, when multiple families, multiple members are affected with COVID, there can be a lot of distress. So if you are a part of the family, if you are, a person experiencing that, or if you are known to the family who is experiencing the same, please make sure that the person who is physically not that ill, but is able to understand that the other people are not doing well, make sure that person's mental health care needs are taken care of. You never know when a person snaps and when that line between stress and distress gets crossed. Almost every single place are doing telephonic counseling sessions now. And if any of you want specifically, you can get in touch with me. I'll let you know whom to approach if you need professional help. This is just understanding that how loneliness and loss can affect you, and how, on the other hand, having at least some kind of structured daily schedule can help counter that. Very importantly, these are the do's and don'ts. Might seem simple, but are often missed. Share with your loved ones if you are grieving. have at least some form of communication, even required with the strangers, have a structure today, rediscover, cherish old memories, even if that makes you feel sad. That's a very, very effective way of getting through grief. And ask for support, hope, or seek professional help. Just remember one thing. A lot of you have apprehension that if I go to a psychiatrist for this, I might be given a medicine which might be addictive for me or which might have side effects. Every form of grief is not pathological. It is not something weird. It is not abnormal. It's a process that we go through. But sometimes in that process, maybe just talking to a friend is not helpful. So you need an extra professional person. Just because you visit a mental health professional doesn't mean that the person is necessarily going to give you medicine. And just few basic dictums before we wind up, and something which I have underlined specifically is self-care. Remember, we keep telling that COVID is a great equalizer. We are all in this together. But at the end of the day, you might feel very, very lonely if you have lost someone special. So if you do not take care of yourself at the beginning, what has gone will not come back. But what is there in your control is still there in your control as long as you want it to be. And this is probably the most important slide of today. If you face, or if you are seeing that any of your known people are facing this, where stopped eating, has a marked loss of weight, looks disheveled and doesn't take self-care, there is a consistent prolonged lack of sleep, has excessive nightmares, is extremely fidgety, totally avoids interaction. Someone who was very jovial and outgoing is totally bound to home, not able to concentrate, somebody who is faltering in their education, in their work, is getting accident prone, and most importantly, self-harm and suicide. There is a 24/7 government helpline called Kiran, which runs nowadays. And there are also the other helplines that I mentioned to you about. But if possible, if you know any doctor, irrespective of whether the person is a psychiatrist or even a general physician, any specialty, these need immediate help. And these mean that even though you are dealing with grief, remember, it is just crossing that 200 level and you are probably going to from a pre-diabetic stage to a diabetes. So before you really have frank mental health issues, it can be prevented. And just to end, grief, it might be a very personal opinion, but how I have faced it or how I've understood it is just another stage of love or another stage of bonding. I'll reiterate, it's not about forgetting a loss, but reliving a loss and getting accustomed to it, accepting it eventually. I can share the slides if you want to, but these are some books which are, I always personally prefer books which give you a perspective, a story, rather than which gives directive ventures like self-help books. So all of these books here, especially my personal favorite, those of you who have read Tuesdays with Maury, will give you an excellent perspective of how the process of grieving goes, and how it's so different for different people, and we learn from each other so much. And again, these are some movies. I'm sure many of you have seen Up, which is one of brilliant movies that discusses grief. And very recently, the movie on dementia, which won the Oscar, The Father, it's a must watch. And again, it shows that the process of grieving starts when you start losing the identity of the person even before the loss of life. And this entire process is important. This gentleman and this book has become extremely famous thanks to COVID-19, Camus, The Plague, and which has been discussed and read multiple times during the pandemic. This was a very famous quote in the last chapter, that loss gives birth to yet another identity. And I really want to share this, that your grief is totally yours. It will be yours, but deal with it the way you want to, with care. Involve people with you. Do not shy away from taking help. And eventually, it will be resolved, or even if unresolved, you will live with it. That's all from my side. Thank you. Thanks for the patience.
Thank you, Dr. Banerjee. That was so insightful and very, if I may say, I think I was also chatting with Hardik in the background, and even he said it felt very soothing. So your words were really something that resonated with a lot of us. I know some of us on this call themselves are personally grieving, losing their loved ones, and I know what we can do is basically just be there for them. And I think the way you have put it across in a way that understanding grief versus depression. So I think the idea is that we care for our friends who are going through grief, and what we don't want at the end of the day is that turning into depression. And that's why we need to be there for them. And this is the reason why we've like started this webinars, and really hope that people can come together and get a little more understanding of the process. I love the slide with the curve thing. Like, I think the curve is my favorite because that's how it is. I think it's such a human aspect of like just thinking like, it's not straightforward. It has to be like a messy curve. So I have some personal things that I want to share, especially about my experiences the past few months. But I want to see if there's anyone else who wants to start with sharing something, or if they had like immediate questions to ask for you. So if anyone in the audience here have any questions, then please go ahead and ask.
Yeah, thank you, Debanjan, for that wonderful presentation. We have one question on YouTube, actually. There are 15 people watching. So Amit Konar asks, could you discuss mental restlessness, inability to concentrate after COVID recovery, and your suggestions for the same?
Okay, that's actually an entirely different domain. I'll just put it briefly across. I think a lot of you must be hearing about something called brain fog. A lot of us have faced this kind of question. So what basically COVID does is, even after you recover from it, there is this sense of a kind of emptiness in head, and you are not able to focus or concentrate even in your day-to-day life. It may not matter much, but if it persists beyond point of time, it can actually get quite disturbing. For most cases, it should resolve on its own. It has taken for many up to 3 months to really come out of it. And we prefer as physicians not to give any medicines. But if you feel that it is really breaking, it's really causing you so much of trouble that many people have problem driving, concentrating on class, traveling, even in normal conversations. If that's the case, then there are certain medicines which are tried, and maybe you can get in touch with a professional. But it resolves. I mean, it's one of the so-called less complicated effects of COVID.
Thank you, Debanjan. Divya, you are sharing something?
Actually, I was wondering, are there any more questions on YouTube? Because I'm not tracking it. I know Hardik and you are.
No.
I have one question to Dr. Banerjee. Like 2 months ago, like my grandmother passed away, and I know how it feels when you are deprived of morning rituals. And right now, we just had ashes immersion ritual just a few days ago. Now I have realized the importance of morning rituals, how they help people to cope up with grief, to understand the loss of person. So I know that pain, how I as a person can help other, because online morning rituals doesn't make sense to me, because it lacks human connect, which is very essential. So how we can support anyone who have lost their loved ones in pandemic? I think you have mentioned about morning rituals, but I just need to know more about it.
Yeah, this is Hardik, right?
Yeah.
Hardik, so firstly, please accept my earnest condolences. I think it's you're right. I mean, online morning rituals, as I mentioned, only few people can really do them, and they seem very artificial, frankly. See, from our viewpoint, I think it's very important to understand something which I haven't discussed in my presentation is grief is also very, it has a lot of social, cultural, ethnic peculiarities. So even if you look at these rituals, they're very different in very different customs and whatever, based on religion, caste, and whatever. And each have their unique ways. There is no right or wrong. Just give me a sec. Yeah. So firstly, it's important to understand that the family or the person who is mourning, what are the kind of rituals or what are the kind of mourning ceremonies that normally it's being done. That's the first thing. Now, of course, during the social distancing time, you really cannot, more people cannot gather at one place. So three things. One, at least have an eye on the person to see that if the basic daily activities are going on. By that I mean, at least having food, sleep, interacting with people, going out, maintaining a kind of at least a basic hygiene. If those are getting impaired more than a week, that's a kind of red signal. Second, try and talk to, if you can talk to the person directly, if you know the person, that's fantastic. If the person confides in you or talks to you, encourage talking. Many of us, when we are really grieving, in spite of discussing all these things, we feel that I'm not really feeling like opening up. And it's not always directly talking about the grief. Sometimes you can talk about, let's say, if somebody, you spoke about grandmother, right? So what was the last time that you did and where you went, or some related aspect, probably going around and coming back to the concept, and eventually the person will discuss. And when the person starts discussing, as a friend or as a well-wisher, you can always encourage the communication. If you are not the direct person of contact, try and find out who are the proximal confidants and who are the people who are in touch with the person who is grieving, and at least give some scope, for the person to share. You cannot expect that if today a loss happens, the next day, immediately the person vents out. But for all of us, we need a kind of, we need an environment. If we are in a vacuum, we cannot really vent. The other person from the other side should also have, it should be conducive to my sharing. So many times what happens when a person is grieving, the other family members might be grieving as well. There might be multiple aspects of grieving. There might not be enough time for the family to be there beside the person. And sometimes it might even be frustrating. So it's just buried under the pillow. So that shouldn't happen. And the last thing is that for anyone, irrespective of what type of loss it is, somewhere I feel that loss of a person is kind of still easier to deal with rather than loss of something more abstract. So let's say many of us have lost our lifestyles, lost the patterns of our day, lost the way we were living life, lost our family dynamics, family relationships, and things like that. So they are quite protracted. One fine day, you cannot discuss about them. But as a friend, as a well-wisher, if somebody is really wanting to discuss any loss related to pandemic, I think we should be all ears rather than be quick to provide remedies. Sometimes it's all that's needed, just giving an audience to the person. But including me, I guess a lot of us are very eager to provide suggestions, and that should be avoided.
Thank you, Dr. Banerjee. That was quite insightful. As you mentioned, at least we can allow another person to vent out their feelings. Yeah, Divya, you can continue.
Thank you, Hardik, for the question. And yeah, we are with you. Yeah, we're here to support everyone, and that is the whole idea. So thank you so much for sharing your story with us and bringing this important question to light. So I guess I'm waiting if anybody else has questions. Kailash sir, any questions?
So, Dr. Banerjee, I have just a simple question. We have talked about grief, and grief can be felt otherwise differently also. Like this time during second pandemic, there have been a lot of requests coming in from friends, relatives, known, unknown, and since I was part of one of the COVID help groups, the grief can be felt from the other side in a different way, that trying to help somebody, and despite your best efforts, if suppose you are not able to help out, and eventually that because of that the other side has suffered, and you yourself feel guilty in that mode, that when what was that I could not help him out, and you start feeling grieved on his behalf. In such situations, how to come out of that, or whether it is genuine to have such kind of grief also is natural, or it is unnatural, or if it is there, then how to cope up with it?
Yeah, Mr. Gupta, thanks for this. I think it is very common, especially as you mentioned, second wave. It has led, I'm sure so many of us have got calls that, I'm not getting beds, I'm not able to get oxygen. Even at home, I'm not getting enough support. And in our, humane capacity, we can only help a few. Many times we are not able to, in spite of being doctors, we are not able to. And as I mentioned in one of the areas, that self-blame or directing a critique towards yourself forms a very important component of grief, especially if you are involved in the care. So let's say if somebody, some life is lost in your absence, even that can come, that kash mein wahan pe hota, when the person has expired. So I would say that having some sort of self-blame or kind of critiquing yourself is a natural part of grief. But again, to raise an alarm, if it becomes so severe that you start having, and it's common, it becomes so severe, you start really hating yourself for that. And you start at one point considering yourself to be the sole reason for that death, one-to-one responsibility. That becomes pathological. And again, that is something which probably signs that you are going ahead to depression and you need professional help. Coming to how we can cope with it, I think again, it starts by accepting it. Yes, there were things that you could have done. If I would have probably got the oxygen in time, I could have saved the person. But then there are only limited things in my control. So let's say, even if I would have got that, there might be other things as well. So I'm not telling that something that is destined to happen will happen. That's a generic statement. That's not what I'm telling. What I'm telling is that, yes, I probably to an extent, I could have saved the person, but I couldn't because things are not there in my control. But probably now there are certain things in my control as to how I deal with it. And that's where, that's what I can do now. The second part of it is, every time you feel that you are blaming yourself for a death, it is very important that you express it. Either you write it down in words and then read what you are writing, or write, type, doesn't matter. But many times what happens, it's very psychological. If it stays inside you, we do not visualize it, we do not see it. When it's in front of you in a form of note, or especially handwritten, because handwriting has kind of your identity inside, you read it, you reflect it, and sometimes, many times, you understand that that's probably all that could have been done. You could not do more. The other part of it is you can even record it and then listen to it like an audio tape. And then you share it with someone that, this is the kind of thing I could have done. It's not, you don't need to go and share with a doctor, but share with someone, preferably someone who is not grieving with you. If you share it with a family member who is also grieving, then that person might in turn imbibe your self-blame, and both of you might start blaming yourselves together. So preferably you do it with somebody who is not a part of the family or not directly grieving. But most important part will be to give your thoughts an audience yourself. And for that, either talk it out, record it and listen to it, or write it down in a brief note and read exactly what is your mind telling you, which part is to blame. Many of us, in our busy lives do not do that and think, chalo, I will deal with it. But it doesn't happen at one point of time. And it might also disturb your sleep, because these kind of thoughts come more when you are actually silent, you are alone, night times. So if it causes persistent sleep disturbance, that's another concern for you, which you might need.
Thank you.
But again, the strategies can be very different for different people. If someone has dealt with situations like this, you're welcome to share your view.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, definitely. I think what really matters is that we all understand what we can do to cope, recognize what stage we are in, and then based on that, we can seek help. It can be professional help or a friend or a family member. But I think you're right. It also depends on, making sure that the other person is not as impacted. Like, say, example, a family member who's also grieving. I think, getting the right support is really important. So I think that needs to be something that people can understand and focus. Yeah, something I wanted to share is that like, I recently came across a quote which said, you don't you don't overcome grief, you basically move forward with it. And I think for me, mainly, like, I went through COVID myself. I had to isolate twice. So I isolated last year and then this year again. And so for me, I think just being isolated for 2-3 weeks each time just led me to feel so feel like claustrophobic, and it definitely made me feel like I've lost a sense of time and space. It gave me like an feeling that an apocalypse is happening outside and I'm not able to do anything. And last year I excessively worked hard to kind of contribute and work for a lot of people who were affected by COVID. But this year, because when I had COVID, I could not do anything. So my grief was, I think, like Kailash sir was saying, that he was on the group and he was struggling with the grief, that how he couldn't help people. My grief was the same, that I'm not able to help people because of my own health. And I think we're grieving many things, like loss of our social life, loss of our routine and everything. But more than anything, I just feel that the grief that you feel for others is something in this pandemic that may not really feel like it's very important, but it is there. It's lingering in each one of us. And I think it will take time for each one of us to accept the fact that, we all went through this together collectively. And I think my approach has been mainly to to get to that acceptance stage, that that this did happen, and that a lot of my friends who lost their loved ones, supporting them through it, that there was not much that I could do, and whatever I did was my best. And so I think that kind of secondary grief is something that I'm still dealing with and working through my own process.
Thanks, Divya. Thanks for sharing this. I think one very important part of it, which many of us have faced, is going through the infection ourselves. And as I said, that loss is not just loss of a person, but it's also loss of your parts of your own self. So when you lose certain abilities, especially during and after COVID, when there is extreme fatigue, not able to do certain things you are used to, that's also a kind of loss. And at one point of time, especially when you get affected, you don't know what's going to follow. So again, there's a loss of certainty as well, with a fear that I don't know how it strikes again or what complications I might have. But it's very important at this juncture to understand that all of us may not express it the same way. And so if any of us come across people who probably are not able to talk about it, or are shying away, or you feel they need professional help, but they are kind of stigmatized to do it, this is the right time to encourage them to do so. And we can do that collectively.
Absolutely. And I think the timing of this webinar is also very important that way, that we know that we are all dealing with it, but it's about time we really discuss it and be able to really move forward with each of the stages that we are in to move towards acceptance. And I think that was really, really helpful. Is there another question? Thank you, Kailash sir. Yeah, it was definitely a very enlightening session. I know we are like way over time, so if anyone had any last questions or any comments, please do share in the chat, or you can speak. Any other comments on YouTube, Sakit? I saw like 10 people were watching until now, like 2 minutes ago.
Yeah, no comments on YouTube. Yeah, I would like to add one last thing apart from what Dr. Debanjan shared.
Sure.
So generally what happens is when somebody is going through grief, the behavior that ensures, like the food habits, the sleep patterns, or even the lack of physical activity, lack of social connection, all these things, go for a toss. People don't tend to take care of these simple aspects. But at that time, it's very important to, focus on these basic aspects, because the behavior that we, do during that time influences the response to grief. And it's vital we eat well, we sleep well, and make sure that some physical activity is there. At the same time, we should maintain some form of social connection, even if it's virtual, because these are, people often try to underestimate the importance of these things, but these are very, very important. And also there are a lot of practices, for example, a lot of yogic practices, some simple forms of pranayam or meditation. These things help immensely in recovery from grief, actually. So I think these are very important and should not be ignored when overcoming grief.
Absolutely. Thank you for adding all that. And with that, I actually want to add a note that Sahaaya is looking to kind of promote at least share information on particular services like this, so that the BITSAA community can benefit from it. And I think it will be done shortly. So I'm looking forward to that as well. So thank you so much, Dr. Banerjee, for your time today. I think it's already been said there, it was an enlightening session. It definitely has helped each one of us here personally, that I can assure you. And I know that I'm sure a lot more people in the BITSAA community will benefit from this conversation. So thanks so much for your time. Thanks so much for all that you do. And thanks everyone for watching. Thanks for joining in so late into the evening. So with that, I'll like to end the session. Any last words you would like to add, Dr. Banerjee?
No, that's all. Thanks. Thank you for selecting such a topic. And as we all know, that mental health promotion itself is something which is important and which has to keep going, pandemic or not. And that's all. And in case if I think I should also take this opportunity to express, my feelings and condolences for everyone who has undergone some sort of loss during the last 1.5 years. It's been a tough time for all of us, but the pandemic will eventually cease. The lessons learned, we can carry it forward.
Absolutely. So
thank you for having me here.
Really supportive words. Thank you so much. Very soothing.
Thank you, Dr. Debanjan. Thank you so much. Thank you, Divya.
Thanks, Dr. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.